Hello and welcome to Newscentre. I'm Parikshit Luthra. Ukrainian President Zelensky is ready to engage with President Donald Trump despite the acrimonious clash at the Oval Office that played out on live TV. Zelensky said he's ready to sign the minerals deal with the United States despite the Friday spat at the White House. Zelensky added that the clash with US President Donald Trump in the Oval House was best left to history. Russian President Putin's spokesperson has said that the spat between Zelensky and Trump shows that Ukraine does not want peace. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer hosted 18 leaders from Europe and Canada at a summit in London over the weekend. He said the leaders will work with Ukraine on a plan to stop the fighting and discuss it with the United States. France and the UK also proposed a one-month truce plan for Ukraine, but no agreement was reached. Here's a report on the Friday meltdown at the White House and its implications for the world at large.
Gambling with the lives of millions of people.
The explosive exchange between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House may have seemed like it came out of the blue.
Doing is very disrespectful.
But according to multiple sources familiar with the matter, it follows weeks of frustration in the Trump camp. The US president and his top aides have, the sources said, seen the Ukrainian leader as an obstacle to their goals of quickly ending the war, restoring ties with Moscow, and sealing a potentially lucrative minerals deal. Trump has long taken an adversarial approach to Zelensky and Ukraine. But the divide has ballooned in recent days as talks over the much-anticipated minerals deal got bogged down. Two White House officials said there had been no attempt to ambush the Ukrainian president, and US Senator Lindsey Graham said he had hoped the deal would go over well.
What I saw in the Oval Office was disrespectful, and I don't know if we can ever do business with Zelensky again.
Exasperation over the minerals deal had threatened to derail Zelensky's trip even before it began. One White House official said on Wednesday that they didn't think an invitation made sense after the Ukrainian president appeared to waver on signing. But a deal was later reached for Zelensky to fly out. Trump has, however, had other frustrations. In recent weeks, he's told his closest advisors that he doesn't like the way in which Zelensky has tried to drum up US support for Ukraine. Trump has also openly pushed for elections in Ukraine and blasted Zelensky for not holding them after his 5-year term ran out in 2024. Ukrainian legislation prohibits holding elections during a state of martial law, which was declared the day Russia invaded in February 2022. At the same time, Trump has been upending decades of US foreign policy by publicly siding with Vladimir Putin and saying he trusts the Russian leader in his desire to end the war. That's a belief that most Western officials rebuke. Kyiv's backers had hoped the deal would help win more support from Trump's Republicans for future aid. Congress last approved assistance for Ukraine in April when Democrats controlled the Senate and Joe Biden was in the White House. Even then, congressional Republicans slow-walked the bill under pressure from Trump. That led to delays in delivering weapons, putting Ukrainian troops on the back foot in the battlefield. Friday's White House meeting ended without a minerals deal being signed and with Zelensky being told to leave.
I caught up with former External Affairs Secretary Sanjay Bhattacharya on what the spat between President Zelensky and President Trump means for the two countries and which way are the diplomatic ties headed going forward. Take a look.
What you described was the most unbelievable series of events that we've experienced in the diplomatic life. I've never seen anything like this before. But I think it tells us and gives us many lessons that we as diplomats and as politicians need to be mindful of. And I think these lessons have already been learned, and I think steps are afoot towards setting the track right. What we did see, I think, at the first level was that Trump and Vance and the US side were very keen to have an understanding with the Ukrainians to change track towards peace rather than the continuation of war. Unfortunately, what this also meant was that the peace that would be extracted would probably be somewhat costly to the Ukrainian side. And perhaps the Ukrainians, with the support of the Europeans, were of the opinion that they could continue the struggle for their sovereignty in a much more deliberate manner and also obtain the assurances for UN security guarantees. But I think the game plan was a little different from the Washington end.
Ambassador Bhattacharya, do you get a sense that it was Zelensky who lost in this meeting? Because there are leaders in Ukraine who are saying that this meeting has led to complete failure of US support for Ukraine. Or do you feel Donald Trump won or Zelensky won? How would you describe the meeting?
Well, I think so far as this meeting is concerned, they both lost. In diplomacy, if there is a win in a negotiation, both sides should be leaving the table happy. If just one side leaves the table happy, there may be risk of it not being durable and certainly not sustainable. So I think in this particular instance, both sides lost. But I will also wish to add that I would have expected that there would have been a greater understanding and desire for bringing peace, for saving the lives of the Ukrainian citizens, many of whom are dying in the battlefield. And I think, to me, as a person who believes in diplomacy, in the progress of pushing for peace, we should have advocated that in a much more concerted manner.
Right. How would we describe the reaction of Zelensky and the way he cross-questioned J.D. Vance? Do you think J.D. Vance should have lost his cool in this manner?
No, I think in any diplomatic situation, neither side is expected to lose their cool, and they should not. But I think this was an unprecedented development, and in some ways, I hope it does not get repeated in diplomatic exchanges in the future. I think to some extent, it is also a function of the stakes that you have for that particular objective. And I think on the US side, they were wanting Europe to assume greater burden sharing and for Ukraine to fall in line to accept the path of peace. But I think on the Ukrainian side, they probably found that the cost of peace as advocated was perhaps too high. So I do not wish to see this as winner and loser, because I really see both sides have lost. But as I said, I think the follow-up steps that have unfolded in the last couple of days have given an indication that we are probably getting back on track.
You know, President Trump tweeted later saying that there was he called it a productive meeting, that they were able to understand views of each other, and Zelensky can return to the White House whenever he wants to talk peace. Does this give an indication that the US president wants to put things back on track as well? And what do you think will be some of the next steps after that? The reason why I ask this, because one also gets a sense that Zelensky was being mocked in the White House. There was a reporter who asked him a question, do you own a suit? Why are you not wearing a suit? J.D. Vance laughed at that question.
I think it's not the suit. Mahatma Gandhi went to meet the King of England wearing his loincloth. So it's not the suit. I think when leaders are representing their country, they are there for the broader objective of what they feel is their people need. And so I don't want to be kind of led into that suit thing. Although that unfortunately did become part of the conversation. I think essentially there was a mismatch in the kind of process that was being adopted and the kind of assurances that were being expected on either side.
Do you feel that both sides go back understanding each other better? Here you had a president of Ukraine who was ready to sign a minerals agreement, who was ready for talks on a ceasefire, but with security guarantees for Ukraine. Do you think next time when both President Trump and Zelensky meet, or leaders of the two countries meet, there will be a better understanding, or you feel that talks have really suffered this time around?
I think there are three critical issues concerned. I think there is a question of Europe, the sense of unity in Europe, and the kind of perception that they have about Russia. The second issue is the key issue of the war that is happening in Ukraine, and how does one deal with that, and the kind of steps, whether one continues with the war or one proceeds towards ceasefire and start negotiating the next steps towards the rapprochement. And the third issue, which I think is equally important, is how do we structure this transatlantic alliance in the days and era of a very mercurial leader, Trump, from Washington. And I think all these issues were, in a sense, having their interplay. Now, just as the interaction between the Americans and the Russians in Riyadh was one which did not have the Europeans or the Ukrainians, or the peace talks before that, which were engineered by various parties, including the Europeans, did not have the Russians. This was an engagement which was actually towards the issue of the guarantees and the cost of burden sharing. But this one did not have the Europeans or the Russians, because this was supposed to be an understanding between the Americans and the Ukrainian. But it is quite understandable that the Europeans were actually in the room without being there. And the kind of unfolding of the scenarios that you see that happened thereafter in London, where they met for securing the future summit, is where this really pans out in a much more obvious and clear manner.
Right. Ambassador Bhattacharya, would you also worry that it's not just about US and Ukraine as to what happened in that room? When the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was here on Friday in Delhi, she made a very strong speech how there are geopolitical wars going on, countries are trying to drive a wedge between the others, supply chains are being weaponized as well. All the direction was towards Russia and Putin over there. Keeping that angry speech in mind, do you think what happened in the White House would probably anger European countries more and make them very wary of dealing with Donald Trump and this United States administration?
I think Europe has continued with the Cold War for much longer than it needed to have. And Russia has assumed the mantle of distrust that the Soviet Union used to have in the past. And perhaps that was not entirely justified. There was a period of time when the G7 and Europe did indeed engage with Russia. And there were economic contacts apart from political and other consultations. There was even a NATO plus Russia. But I think that, in a sense, was not fully recognized by the Europeans. And so that mistrust of Russia continues to a great extent, not only because of what Europe feels, but also what Russia does very often. And to be honest, I think Russia has got to do a lot better in some of those things. So I think what this actually opens is to cast aside. If you do have peace, you can actually start talking about the other things. Because when you are in a stage of war, you're so caught up in that particular emotion that you cannot think about how you can actually have a constructive, cooperative relationship. And I think that is indeed possible with the Russians. But today, I am very hopeful that, what came out, not out of the statements of Ursula von Leyen in Delhi, or the statement by Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO in Brussels. But what came out of London in the European summit is definitely much more hopeful, because there what we found was actually the different voices that came out after the Oval Office incident, let us just call it. Because while everybody almost supported Ukraine, and many of them supported Zelensky in person, there were a few, the Hungarians and the Slovaks, who said that, no, I think we should really push for peace. And Meloni had also mentioned that we need to have the Americans on the table. So by the time they got to London, they had actually had this brief understanding between Macron and Starmer that they would try and prepare a draft agenda for peace. And this is, the Europeans now saying that they need an agenda for peace, which then Starmer would take to Trump. and then and see how that goes further. So I
All
think in some ways it has set off the discussion for peace within Europe. And the fact that you can actually engage with Russia in a non-confrontation manner without that passion of the war behind you is actually a welcome thing. I'm not saying it happened because of the incident in the Oval Office, but I think that realization has come about. And the third part of it, which I was wanting to mention about the transatlantic alliance and how the future will unveil, is that now the question of burden sharing is being assumed by the Europeans in a much more responsible way. So they are now going to set on Thursday, the European Council is supposed to meet to define that they need to step up their defense commitments to 2% of GDP. And what that will do is that it will enhance Europe's capability. And it will, even if it does stay as a member of the alliance, I think it'll be more of a partnership, which is a much more vital and vibrant way to proceed in the 21st century.
Time for a short